You are listening to the
World Extreme.
World Extreme Medicine.
The World Extreme Medicine
Podcast.
In this episode, we're going to be speaking with Will Millard on jungle survivals in the extremes. So what we want to do really is really dig into Will's experience around some prolific and unparalleled insights into jungle adventure. So Will is a renowned writer, television presenter, and indeed seasoned explorer who's dedicated his life to documenting some of the most remote and challenging environments on Earth. So Will's passion for exploration has taken him deep into the jungles of West Papua, where he lived amongst the Korowai Tribe and gained unparalleled insights into their way of life and survival techniques. So his expeditions have not only showcased the beauty and danger of these environments, but also highlighted the resilience and adaptability of the indigenous communities he encountered. So with award-winning documentaries such as Hunters of the South Seas and My Year with the Tribe, Will has brought the stories of these remote communities to a global audience. He's also earned critical acclaim and numerous awards for these documentaries. So join us today as we delve into Will's jungle survival experiences, but also uncover the lessons he learned from spending a year with the tribe, and also the incredible journey that has defined his career. Welcome, Will, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. What a wonderful introduction.
It's great to have you with us, actually. And I wondered if we could just initially kick off, Will, by just digging into your early inspirations. Just what first sparked your interest in exploration and adventure?
Yeah, I've got to be honest, I grew up in a very sort of sheltered way. I came from a very small village in an area of England called the Fens, which is over in the kind of far eastern side of the country. Very, very rural, lots of farming, very quiet, sheltered upbringing. So in terms of kind of early inspirations, there weren't really any. There was no one in my family that traveled to far-flung places. Aside from watching David Attenborough on the television, there wasn't really kind of that inspiration there. Nobody worked in journalism or had ever even had a job in the media. It was just a very quiet, very sheltered upbringing, but I was very lucky because it was so quiet and so safe. I had this extraordinary opportunity to explore the area around my house. I grew up next to a little river, the Well Creek, in a small village. And me and my pals, we just used to go out exploring every single day. We'd be on the river, building rafts, going fishing, going into the orchards, taking these huge long bike journeys through the fields and into all the various sort of networks of dikes and drains. And, so I think it all started very locally and very organically for me. In terms of taking that leap to realizing there was a bigger, wider world out there for me, I can remember I used to be really terrified of just leaving the village, like truth be told. I didn't like it when we went on holiday. And I can remember when I was only 8 years old, turning around to my mum and saying, I want to become the local magician. I'm not interested in ever leaving this place. But then I remember being at school and, as a lot of you do, you kind of get to kind of 15, 16 years old, you're trying to make plans, think about what you want to do with your life, what A levels you want to take. And someone came in and just gave a school talk, and all they'd done was go to somewhere in sort of sub-Saharan Africa to work in a school. And I just couldn't believe that somebody from my school had gone and done something like that. I remember just being so inspired, just listening to her, just talking about her sort of very basic day to day. And it just, I don't know, it just made me think, well, actually, maybe I could go and do something like that. And that certainly sparked it. And then, to be honest with you, I had no idea what I was going to do when I left school. So when I did leave school, me and a couple of friends went and worked in the local factory, saved up some money. And that was it. We went and had our first experience overseas. But I don't know if it wasn't for that person coming in and talking to us, whether I would have actually ever taken the leap at all.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Never underestimate the power of just inspiring other young minds, actually. And just you talking there just reminds me of, the need to get into these schools and actually tell people about experiences and adventures. Because like with you, Will, you were sat there as a child, just expanding horizons of what's possible. and just allowing you to enter into that and expanding your possibilities is fantastic. And I guess there's an adjoinder to that. Well, what drew you to the jungle? Because it is quite a unique environment. It's quite challenging in many regards. One of the most challenging environments I've experienced. What drew you to the jungle environment?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And just going back to what you just said, I mean, it's why going into schools now is such an important part of my work as well. I think that I certainly feel like I've had an incredibly privileged experience as a result of my work. But part of that privilege is going into schools and showing them what I've learned, So I do like an Ask the Explorer talk, and I do have quite a lot of exotic animals in this house where I live, and they go in and it's a real sort of living show and tell table, and it makes a difference because I remember being a kid just like that. And I don't think if you can't show kids why things are so important and why they're so special, then how you can't really expect them to care about it, and they're not going to get that through their devices or watching television. So, it is really important to go in there and get in there face to face. But getting back to your question, yeah, I mean, in terms of the jungle, the inspirations for the jungle, I mean, I remember the first jungle I entered. I was very lucky. I got an opportunity to study abroad. I went to Singapore, and it was the time, really, the advent of the low cost airline. We'd had like Ryanair and EasyJet over here in the UK, but over there they were just starting their own versions of those airlines, which meant someone like me could, on a student loan, you could get to like Borneo for 25 quid or go to Sumatra. Suddenly all of these parts of Indonesia and Malaysia just were so accessible to me, and I was living there in the middle of it all. So I orchestrated that year so that I only ever had to be in lectures on a Tuesday, Wednesday, and a Thursday, and the rest of the time I was gone. And that was where I started to kind of cut my teeth, really. But as soon as I was in the jungle, I can just remember feeling this incredibly overpowering feeling of excitement. It was such an exciting place to be. I felt like it was so alive in a way that so many other places that I'd been to until that point just weren't. And if you were stood in a really good primary rainforest, you can stand in one place and see the whole ecosystem working around you. You look down, you can see all the insects in the leaf litter running around your feet, the fungi, giant hardwood buttress rooted trees, lianas going up into the upper the canopy where you can see all different kinds of animals, hornbills, eagles. Maybe if you're in the right part of Southeast Asia, you're going to see monkeys, great apes. Over in Papua, I've done so much of my work, you might see even other species, tree kangaroos, cuscus, all of these different things. And I just found it like a riot for my senses, and I just became completely addicted. I think people sort of say about the travel bug biting, and they have periods of their life where they go on a gap year or they go and do some independent travel, and I did all of that, and I just never wanted to stop. And once I'd found the rainforest, I knew that that was my thing, and I wanted to go back there as much as I could possibly afford.
So outside of human contact, we're going to dig into your experience with the tribe actually in a second, but putting the tribe aside for a second, just to your point, Will, that you're right, this overwhelming sense that you're in this ecosystem which is just alive, from the ground upwards, the trees, the birds, the primary rainforest, just everything about the ecosystem is alive. And you're right, it's quite overwhelming actually, because it can be quite a noisy place just with life, which is very dissimilar or not familiar to sort of Europe or North America. But could you maybe speak to what drew you into spending time with this tribe? Because I think what's fascinating is spending time with the tribe, learning how they habituate to the environment, just learning how they just their fundamental way of life and how they navigate this ecosystem.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, the animals were the gateway drug to the people. Once I'd kind of spent time in the jungle and obviously kind of experienced my own struggles there as well, where it's really hard. You're in this very claustrophobic, sweaty environment where there's lots of insects that want to bite you. If you get injured or you get cut, it's going to get infected. It's a tough, marginal place to survive as a human. So when I learned about people that were living in this place full time and not just surviving, but really properly thriving, I wanted to know how they did it. So first it was the animals, then it was the environment, and then it was the people. So, I mean, that all really kind of began in 2006. I moved to New Guinea full time. I became a teacher in West Papua in a place called Jayapura, one of the cities. And all of my time, all of my free time was spent studying the people, studying the languages, and then going to these parts of New Guinea, as much as I could afford to, really. And that was where the idea first germinated. To study intertribal trade routes in New Guinea. I always felt that when you look at certainly mainstream Western media, the way that the people of Papua are portrayed is always along the same sorts of lines. People reference the cannibalism, people mention the savagery, the warfare, the headhunting, all of these different things. Yet, when you spend time in New Guinea and you start to visit all of the different tribal territories, you realize that although they might not have shared languages, they've got shared culture, they've got shared customs, they've got shared religious practices, and they've got shared trade items. Long before Western people had ever had any involvement in New Guinea, all of these things were in place. And what I discovered through speaking to the people and learning about their anthropology was that there was this ancient intertribal trade route that had linked all of the people in a huge chain of intertribal trade that made it the longest running trade route probably in human history. But no one had ever heard of it outside of the island. So that was 2006 and 7, and then I started to get my sort of first big expeditions funded. So I got my first bit of grant money from the Royal Geographical Society in 2009, and at that point I tried to go across the central mountain spine of New Guinea. And then in 2012, I went back and did the Trans-Papua when I attempted to cross New Guinea. And then that very much sort of teed me up for, I guess, doing the BBC work. I had expeditions in between as well in West Africa. And then eventually I came back 2016 and 17 to live with the Korowai people in my year with the tribe. But by that point, I'd already had a lot of experience in Papua. I mean, relative to most people from the UK, right? Probably in total, I'd say getting on for 2.5, 3 years spent in Papua alone. So, I'd learned Indonesian and I'd learned, a few of the sort of various sentences and a few of the sort of major tribal dialects that I'd visited. But yeah, the people, I mean, what can you say about the people of Papua? They're incredibly varied. Their way of life is completely attuned to the environment where you find them living. So in the Balian Valley, which is this flat bottom valley within this huge crown of mountains, people there live in a very, very different way, at that altitude, in that temperature as well, to the way that they do in the Korowai, which is in the middle of this sort of swampy rainforest. So, you really no two places were the same. There was huge amounts of variance, but the one thing above all that I would say is that the specificity about the way that they lived within those areas could not have been better tailored to the environment they were in. We were talking about thousands of years of ingenuity to be able to work out the best way to survive in the environment that they decided to settle in, some tens of thousands of years ago as a people. And kind of unpicking that and understanding that, and then working out how it all worked within this web, this great framework of these trade routes was, I mean, incredible. It was incredibly complex. It would have taken me many, many lifetimes to have figured out.
Listen, that's fascinating for a number of reasons, but one is that, like you said, there's actually incredible variation in amongst a people group, even in one environment, albeit there's very different parts of that environment. And could I get you to speak to your habituation or your indeed sort of naturalization into that? Because as you said, it's quite uncomfortable in many regards. It's extremely humid as an environment. Most things want to bite you. There is massive diversity of plants, insects, birds, and everything else. But On top of that, there's a whole cultural aspect, as you said, of the tribe. Could I get you to speak to your habituation of, food, hydration, and indeed way of life in the jungle? Did it take some time to habituate, or was it a gradual process, or did it occur quite quickly?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say it does take time. I mean, if we just focus on like the lowland tropical rainforest, it is the jungles of Papua are very different to other jungles in the world. You've got a very different set of species. It's the Australian side of the Wallace line. So you've not got the kind of big cats and the big ape species that you get in Borneo or Indonesia. It's a bird island. There's an enormous amount of snakes. 8 out of 10 of the most deadly snakes in the world are found in New Guinea alone. Um, you have clouds of mosquitoes. They have several species of these sweat bees that will literally stick to your face, like festoon you everywhere you're walking. You've got to be so careful with your kit. If you leave something out on the forest floor at night, it is going to be covered in insects. I remember once my boot had fallen off the stick that I'd sort of propped it up on, and I woke up and all I could see was the outline of where my boot once was, and it was completely coated in termites. You couldn't see a single centimeter of leather. The people are tough, I mean, the skin on their feet is incredibly hard. They're able to mold their feet to the logs and the footpaths that they've made through the jungle. Their movement, their economy of movement in that environment is incredible. They're incredibly strong as well. Like the amount that they're able to carry is extraordinary, particularly the women. I'd see women carrying sacks of sweet potatoes with their kids in them across the front of their foreheads, like just such powerful necks. I'm walking through this jungle like it was nothing, whereas I'd be there carrying like a quarter of the weight and falling over every 5 steps. So, it does take time. It takes time to get used to moving in that environment. What's the most efficient way to do it? To work out even just basic stuff like what's the best way for your pack to sit on your back? What's the best way for you to tie your jungle hammock? What's the best way for you to keep clean, in a place where everything is covered in filth, and these things are so fundamentally important to not getting poorly. Fundamentally for somebody like me, you're never going to fully habituate yourself into an environment like that, not in the same way that a Papuan could. And I used to always remind myself on an expedition that it wasn't about how well I could adapt to the environment in Papua when I was in it. It was about how far back I could push almost the decline, the point of no return where your body starts to just go into perpetual terminus, where you get to the end and be like, I can't go on anymore. And a lot of that, I mean, really, to be honest with you, one of the major difference between what I was doing and the way that Papuan people were living was that I was moving through that environment. Whereas one of the major keys to their success was collaboration and obviously setting yourself up in one good place and not really moving from that area, or at least keeping that as your base when you go out and then come back to that one place, whereas we were constantly on the move through the forest. So that certainly helped. But regardless, you could never, ever get yourself as good as a Papuan person was going to be in their own environment. They were so specialized in what they were doing. So yeah, I mean, basically trial and error a lot of the time, just trial and error and repeated experience until you got to a point where you felt, confident in that place.
So I want to kind of dig into jungle survival skills really, and it sounds very nuanced and specialized, but something you just said there is really interesting about actual just basic self-care, keeping your feet clean, taking showers or indeed washing in the rivers whenever you can, but also hydration and just basic fundamental nutrition, trying to keep food clean, trying to keep your hands clean. Could you speak to some of the jungle survival skills you used, maybe, albeit uh, looking at the self-care is super important actually and essential. Was there anything else? I guess working with hammocks and machetes and indeed navigation, were these all sort of fundamental prerequisites?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's a couple of things that, I think are really interesting. Like, again, in the West, in the Western media, there's this obsession with kind of survival, bushcraft survival, catching your own food, foraging, all of those sorts of things. And, you know, we found out pretty early on that the amount of calories that you burn trying to kind of set traps and catch your own food, especially when you've got an imperative to kind of keep moving through an environment, make it a pointless exercise. You know, it's very, very difficult to be able to catch enough calories to be able to justify carrying in, you know, things like snares or traps or you know, fishing rods and line. And I'm an avid angler. I'm a good angler. I'd go so far as to say, but I can remember at one point when I kind of set myself up to catch catfish, and just the amount of time and danger that I had to go through to just get bait, you know, in the middle of the night, trying to find worms and, you know, any kind of like creepy crawly that animal would eat, versus the time that was then spent kind of setting deadlines and then getting the fish in the morning. You know, sometimes having to swim down and pull them out from beneath rocks. It just wasn't worth it. So, you know, I'd say yes, nutrition and hygiene are probably the two most fundamentally important things. You know, you do need to try and stay clean. It's very difficult to stay dry. You know, there are a lot of times where we would actually just down tools and take our shoes and socks off to try and let our feet dry out a little bit if you were in the middle of the day in the sun. I had trench foot at points in my time, and it's as soon as you get that, you know, that bacterial infection, you are on a hiding to nothing. It just spreads between your toes. It's horrendous, you know, and it will get to a point that you can't walk. So, you know, it's so important to try and look after the most basic things. People, not only do they get obsessed with kind of that sort of like extreme wilderness bushcraft, they also get over preoccupied with dangerous animals. You know, the snakes. I mean, in New Guinea, things like the cassowary that can disembowel you or the kick. You know, all of these kind of things. You know, forest pigs that might charge at you. It's probably not going to happen. The biggest thing that you're likely to do is just be tired or exhausted from, you know, a lack of proper hydration, and you just make the most basic error with your knife, you know, and chop your fingers off. You know, it's as simple as that. So yeah, I mean, I just think a lot of the times for us, you know, I mean, just to give you one really good example, I would say one of the most basic things that we learned to do: if you start a job, finish it before you start another job. It sounds so silly, but you'd be so surprised how many times you start doing something like you've taken off your boots. Right, I'm going to put my boots on these two sticks and make sure that they're properly elevated. And you've taken off your boots and suddenly you're like, oh, I'll just tie my little corner of the hammock up properly because that looks like there might be, you know, you might get some rain ingress there, and you tie them up, and before you know it, you've left your boots on the floor. And then you forget that your boots are on the floor and something horrible sneaks inside, and before you know it, you've put your boots on your feet, and that's it, you're done for. It's those little lapses of concentration. And it happened to us at one point. My expedition partner, he had collected water from a stream. He had taken the Puri tabs out of our bag. He'd popped the Puri tabs into the bottles, and then he'd done the bottles up, and then we got distracted and walked off, and he'd left the Puri tabs in the forest. And that was our whole supply of water purification. Half our supply, actually. I had half. But devastating for the expedition. There's no way back. You've just instantly halved the time you can do in the forest. Luckily, we were able to go back and we found them. But we were really strict with ourselves after that. It was like, literally, Puri tab into the bottle. Say it to yourself. Top on the bottle in the bag, Puri tabs in the bag. What's next? Don't get distracted by other peripheral things, because it can ultimately cost your life. You know, there was another example in 2013. I was seems very benign. I was on the Pennine Way in the pits of winter in the UK, and I was camping, and it was about -13. I think it dropped down to in the Peak District. I cleared an area in the snow. I'd set my tent up. And I was like, great, I'd had this epic all day, and suddenly I was like, my shelter's up, you know, big tick in the box, managed to do that on my own, no worries. All I needed to do was take my boots off and get into the tent. And what I did was I took my gloves off and then started working on my boots, but my boots were frozen solid. My fingers went instantly numb. And then I couldn't open the tent to get my stove on to warm up my hands, to then continue to be able to do the job. I couldn't even undo my coat to get my hands into my armpits to get some free flowing blood into them. You know, in the end, I had to like undo the zip with my teeth, and then I managed to get them in there, warm them back up, gloves back on. I then got the stove on, cooked up a little bit of warm water, poured them on my boots, easily undid my shoelaces and got inside. But I just got distracted in that moment. It was like, sweet, let's get in the tent, you know, not thinking about the process of taking off my boots. And suddenly I then couldn't get in the tent, couldn't take off my boots, and was, you know, really potentially in trouble, even just in the UK, you know. So it's something that we really drill into each other now, and something that I constantly remind myself of. It's like, finish the job. What's the job? Say the stages. If you're tired, you're dehydrated, say the stages of the most simple tasks, because you'd be surprised at how easily you can forget to do something and how dire the consequences of just messing up something simple can be.
Listen, that rings true in many regards, certainly to my experience in the jungle. And you're right, it's not necessarily the big things, it's the smaller things, the bullet ants, you know, just not visualizing where you put your hands. So when you're getting out of a hammock, and you know, you put your hand on a tree, or indeed even on the hammock itself, on the horizontal aspect of the hammock, look where your hands are before you put them on, because bullet ants are bullet ants for a reason. You know, it feels like you've been shot when they bite you. They are, and little things like that can absolutely, it's not ruin your day, ruin your week, because your hand is, or your foot is on fire for the full week. So you're right, it's almost this death by a thousand paper cuts. And to your point around, you know, even if you're exposed into direct sunlight, you know, that sunburn grating on your bag, or you know, just the little things actually which become big things. Well, can we just pivot slightly and look at, before we look at some of the personal growth aspects of you being away, could I just get you to speak for a moment to the cultural exchange, and just also sort of what you really took from working with the Korowai tribe, and just, yeah, just some of the take homes really, so some of the things that kind of really hit you, or began to become more of a revelation to you about this tribe.
I think specific to the Korowai, you know, one of the biggest things came really from the more time that I spent and invested with those people. It was, anyone who's seen my Year of the Tribe on the BBC, and it is still available on the iPlayer if you wanted to go and watch it now. You know, you'll see it was a fraught time. It was a series where we took the decision early on as a crew that we would show as much as we possibly could, good and bad. And if I was to completely simplify that series, effectively it was happening in two locations. There was a village, which was the place, our gateway really to the forest behind. And my experiences there were very fraught. It was a very difficult place to work. But away from them was this pair of elderly brothers that lived in a far more traditional way, right out in the middle of the jungle, couple of days walk from the village. And they were incredible men, Holp and Halap they were called. And it was only really through spending deep time with them, and especially time on my own, when, you know, there was a period where the crew left me alone. Again, you'll see the series was very fraught. There was a lot of kind of cultural misunderstandings around, you know, what people were getting paid, what was supposed to be happening on the shoot, on the series, what they wanted us to do, what we wanted to hope and capture ourselves. I mean, to give you, again, just a very quick bit of background, the whole series was massively complicated and compromised by the fact that the overwhelming experience of the Korowai that had ever had any dealings with outsiders was based around them exaggerating a piece of their culture, which was that they lived in tree houses. Film crews and high-end tourist groups had been getting them to build these insanely high, sort of 40, 50 meter high tree houses that they were purported to have lived in, although they never had lived in them. So we kind of exposed that on the first program. So immediately we were sort of on the back foot, because it was like kind of a little bit like, well, this isn't what you're kind of supposed to do. You know, you're supposed to turn up here, you film the 50 meter high tree houses, we take off all of our clothes, everyone gets paid, jobs are good, and you go back with something spectacular. we get money in our pocket. But we turned up and we were like, well, this isn't what we're here to do. It was actually what we'd been sent to do. The BBC had filmed these very high tree houses before in a series called Human Planet. So it put us in a real tight spot with our bosses because we were exposing them as well as this thing that had been going on. So that was part of the reason why things were so fraught within the village, but there were other reasons as well. And, you know, the Korowai are called the Society of Others. The preeminent anthropologist, Rupert Stash, brilliant anthropologist who'd spent his life's work working with the Korowai, had described them as such. They were very, very different to the other groups in Papua. The place where they lived is so marginal and so difficult to survive. The way that they'd done it traditionally was by living in very small family groups, not in villages, spread out right across the forest. So once the kind of Indonesian kind of takeover of Papua had happened, and they were encouraging people to come out of the forest and to live in these government assembled villages by the riversides, there were always going to be problems, you know, within the villages, because people just didn't have that experience of all living together. So even when we weren't there, there were a lot of problems in the village, and especially this village because it was such a new one. The ones directly upstream and downstream were a lot easier to go into and work, which we just kind of worked in them, to be honest. But, you know, this was the one that was the gateway to Hope and Halap, and they were such special men, and they were probably the last of their kind in terms of people living out in the forest in that very small, tight-knit way. But one of the big revelations that came to me was when they talked, you know, they deconstructed the giant treehouse thing. You know, I remember them laughing at me, being like, I can't believe, you know, you lot are obsessed with these giant tree houses. It's ridiculous. How could you have thought we lived that way? You know, have you not got toddlers in your culture? Like, you're not going to take a 3-year-old into a 50-meter high treehouse. You know, it was embarrassing. Do you know what I mean? I was like, you know, I knew that they'd been racially stereotyped. You know, let's call it what it is. And I couldn't believe how long it had gone on for. So, you know, I had to kind of take that on the chin, and that was like the first month. And then I went back again the second month, you know, and they started to reveal more aspects of the way that they read the forest. You know, they did live in tree houses, just much smaller ones, you know, 5 meters high. And from that elevation, you were above the mosquito line, which obviously really helped. But then also you could feel the forest. You could figure out when the best time to go and hunt was, you know, which you needed to do because you didn't want to waste calories hunting at a time when it wasn't optimum. In the third month, I lived alone with Hope and Halap during the rainy season. That was a really tough time. There was no food around, you know, we were effectively starving, you know, and that was a real eye-opening experience as well, you know, like having to build that resilience and bloody mindedness to get through that period. But then by the fourth trip, they started to talk about the Hahua, which was one very specific forest god that they had. It was a demon that they believed that was responsible for all of the shortcomings, all of the bad things that would happen to Korowai people, you know, illnesses, injuries, things that would go wrong within your family life. It was all down to this Hahua demon. And Hope and Halap explained that it lived in almost a parallel universe to the way that they lived. So we ate sago grubs by the ton, whereas the Hahua ate worms, which explained why the Korowai had this really interesting fear of the earthworm, which was pretty tough when I was out looking for fishing bait. They believed that the Hahua lived on the ground, which was why the Korowai decided to live up high, or one of the other reasons why they decided to live up high. And then crucially, the Hahua was white to their black, which explained why my people had so much trouble when they'd first gone to the Korowai, because, you know, I remember Holt talking to me about how he'd never seen a white person before, and then suddenly these people rock up and he's like, these people are the manifestation of our deepest, darkest, most evil fears. You know, so Westerners would come back from the Korowai with these stories of these sort of savage people, you know, that were quick with the bow and arrows and stuff. But the truth was that they felt like they were facing their biggest evil, you know. So if you spend enough time and dig deep enough, you will always get this incredible understanding that you couldn't possibly have got if you just take people at face value, no matter where you are in the world. I found that incredibly illuminating. And frankly, by the end of my time there, I'd forgotten that we'd even gone there to film these giant tree houses in the first place. You know, it was an extraordinary privilege.
So just as we start to come into land, Will, just a couple of more questions. One would be really around personal growth, and just through your explorations and adventures, how did it sort of shape your personal philosophy and outlook on life?
One of the things that we haven't really had much for time to talk about in 2012, when I was doing the Trans Papua expedition, um, I made a really bad error of judgment, and an area that I thought was an intertribal trade route. You know, I used to look at these. I've got these old maps on the wall behind me, and you know, this was before satellite mapping was readily available. So I used to look at the old maps and try and figure out routes between villages. And I thought I'd found one in a really, really remote part of Papua, and I hadn't. And me and my friend Callum, we descended this Whitewater River and basically ended up getting trapped in this 400 square mile tract of uninhabited forest and had an absolute survival epic on our hands. We were alone in that forest for a month. We both nearly starved to death. How we got out of there alive is still a real mystery. And I think that was sort of like the catalyst for a big switch inside me. I think that I had probably in my younger years, you know, in my sort of, you know, earlier on in my 20s, I'd kind of probably arrived with a bit too much bravado, you know, a little bit too much boy's own adventure, you know. I would say it would be unfair to say like arrogance, but probably a bit overconfident, you know. That experience, I think, humbled me in a really, really massively important way, and in a way that probably made me understand where my limitations were. I came out of that experience knowing exactly, you know, where my limitations lied. You know, I was amazed. It was amazing to come out of it and to know what I could put up with and what I could endure. You know, way beyond anything I ever thought I could have done. You know, and that was an amazing thing to have. But more than anything, it was this kind of deeply humbling experience. You know, and I think that to anybody going off and going on jungle expeditions, I would say go out there, enjoy yourself, make the most of every moment you've got out there. But remember, you know, life is this most precious privilege. It's this most precious gift, and hold on to that. You know, try not to take stupid risks and put yourself in compromising situations. You know, control the controllables. Make sure that you are in control of the things that are easiest to control, and listen to what people are telling you that have been there before. Listen to the experienced voices in your team, and listen to the local experience as well, because they're the people that fundamentally really know what they're talking about. You know, don't be afraid to take risks and push yourself into places, you know, that could be uncomfortable, because that is how we all grow as people. But don't do that at the expense of your own personal safety.
Listen, that's profound for a number of reasons. Like you said, going to and beyond your limits. But also, I think the most important thing about that is something you just said there, is about this element of self-reflection and personal growth through self-reflection. And you're right, actually. You know, just my appetite for risk. Actually, I think it's true to say, like, certainly my story and maybe yours as well. You become more conservative as you grow into your 30s and 40s. I'm certainly, my appetite for risk and my conservative nature is the bar isn't in the same place. And my 20s definitely was more pushing my boundaries, see where the boundaries were, but. Yeah, withdrawing from those is actually certainly more where I'm at now. Will, could we just, as we start to come into land, one question would be: you are writing a few books at the moment, and I'd just like to speak to that, actually, just to speak to the interplay between storytelling and the factual, the sort of the hard facts. Could you maybe speak to what kind of books you're writing at the moment, and B, what's the differential between sort of storytelling and factual reporting?
It's a great question, and I think that it's something that you know, particularly the BBC and other kind of, the big kind of standard bearers for public trust. They've had to face down a lot of these questions about where fact and storytelling meet. For me, I think if you're telling a barefaced lie, and you can't do that. You just can't. Like, I think that the stories of the places that I've been and the people I've met are so wondrous, that you don't need to do it. If you dig deep enough, you'll find what you're looking for, especially when you're in such spectacular environments as, the jungles of West Africa or West Papua. You need to just try harder to unpick the spectacle. Don't just go for the lowest common denominator and just make something up based on other stuff that you might have heard before. Find your own truth, because it will always be far wilder than any fictionalized account that's been said about those people or those places. So yeah, I mean, for me, I'm so blessed that I've been able to kind of pivot into writing. I mean, never say never. I would always go back to television if the door opened again. But it's a very different time and a place now. But I love my writing, and I feel so blessed to be able to do it now as an adult in their 40s with kids and responsibilities at home. But also, really, for me, that where we live is amazing. I think more than anything, like, going to these incredible places has made me appreciate what we've got around here. None more so than during the time when we were all sort of locked down during COVID. I really looked to my doorstep to kind of tell the next set of stories that I wanted to tell. So yeah, for me, it started with sort of like children's nature books. I made a series of picture books for really young kids. That then led on to a book that I've just got out at the moment called My First Day Fishing, which allows young people to really kind of understand the magic of water and how they might go out there and catch their very first fish. I also wrote a book with a hermit, Ken Smith, the Hermit of Traig, a legit hermit. He spent 40 years living on his own in the wilderness of the Highlands of Scotland. I went up and met him and worked with him together and wrote his story. I'm working with, this is an exclusive for your podcast, I'm working with Gordon Buchanan, an incredible award-winning wildlife cameraman who's been everywhere. And we're writing his book together. Gordon's stories are absolutely incredible. As a storyteller, he is mind-blowing. So I'm just putting the finishing touches to that at the moment with him. And then I've got another couple of kids' books out. I've got The Beaver That Saved Christmas is coming out in October ahead of the festive season. And then I've got The Squirrel Who Lost Her Nuts coming out in the spring. There was a lot of editorial chat about whether it should be a boy and a girl, and we decided to err on the side of caution and go with her for reasons that are probably obvious for the children's market. So yeah, very, very lucky. And then I'm just about to begin a brand new project with the Ordnance Survey, actually, writing a book about the historical maps of Britain and how basically you can tell the history of the UK through our maps alone, which I'm super, super excited about. We might have a big television project brewing as well in the pipeline, but I definitely can't say anything about that at the moment. But just watch this space, please. Then and hopefully we'll get it out there. But yeah, I mean, returning to your original question, be true to yourself. Work hard to find the unique story that you can tell anywhere you are in the world. That there is supreme brilliance and wonder to be told everywhere. So you don't need to twist. You don't need to twist between a pure fantastical story and the facts.
Listen, well, that's fantastic. And what we'll do in the show notes is we'll put links to your work, to your fantastic work, actually, because it is really refreshing to get it's an organic experience through your eyes, which is profoundly what the documentaries are. And we'll also put links to your books as well, because it is immersive, and I think that's probably what you're after as well. But you really do feel like you're living right there with you in the jungle. So, but also thank you for the past hour. It's been great just to get your insights and indeed sort of just vicariously live through some of your experiences. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's been honestly an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the episode.
please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to. Please also head over to the World Extreme Medicine website, where you can find more engaging content on extreme medicine webinars and indeed the collection of courses from our global network, including humanitarian, disaster relief, expedition, space, military, tactical, and performance medicine. Thanks again.